Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Hermenegildo Marin Wash Process Mexico from Passenger Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Passenger, based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And this coffee is our March 2023 Coffee of the Month, as it was selected by you guys as the coffee you wanted to see us review. But it was originally a suggestion to us by Acavia8. So shout outs to and thank you to Acavia8 for the suggestion. They said that this is arguably the best coffee they had ever had in their entire lives. So I figured the least we could do was put it in our Coffee of the Month poll. And once it was announced as our winner, we actually had mixed feedback, as some people said that they really enjoyed this coffee, while others said that they were a little let down by the overall results that they had. So it's going to be interesting to see how this one turned out for us, as this right here is day 34. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Passenger's recipe, which is a 15.625 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, about 99 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee is in line with the previous Mexican coffee we had reviewed from Passenger earlier this year, which is to say that Passenger does roast on the lighter side of the spectrum relative to a lot of their contemporaries. This one, on the other hand, had a slight bit more development to it, where a lot of people would call this a little bit more in line with a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and the cup did offer a lot of natural-like vibrancy characteristics to it, with a focus on the listed citric aspects right at the forefront of the cup. Otherwise, it was a pretty robust profile with a heavier body and a slightly nutty chocolate-like base and finish to the cup. That resulted in a pretty traditional Central American first impression, as it really offered a lot of those traditional Central American aspects. Day 16 ran it to the Chemex, and the cup continued to offer so many natural-like vibrant components that it slightly impacted the overall clarity to the cup. As on these first 2 days, if I was making a tasting wheel, I probably would have charted the cleanliness around a level 3, because it didn't necessarily have the sort of clarity I might have been looking for a washed coffee. One thing I did found was a little bit more of a structured chocolate to the cup. As it settled, there were also more of the fruit components, so this orange as well as yellow fruit qualities to the cup, and they improved upon the cool down. So there were some positive traits to this one, but we continue on to day 19 as we ran it through the April brewer, and it was a little less harsh as it remained vibrant in a slightly more toned down sense. There was a little bit of extra honey in the cup, which was surprisingly vibrant in the finish as well. More of the citric forward aspects to the cup are present yet again, with a slightly bitter part of that and a significant bit more vibrancy within the cool down. So there were some positives to the April dripper, but up to this point had pretty mixed results with this coffee. That being said, I traditionally experienced the best from Passenger's coffees with a little bit more time. So here on day 22, ran to the V60 with Passenger's recipe, and it has the best it has been up to this point by a fair bit of a distance, as the orange-like aspect was actually really strong, really vibrant, but in a positive way, as this coffee reminded me a little bit of an orange creamsicle, as it had so many of those aspects in this kind of creamy sense, especially as the coffee did cool down. A slight bit more of that zesty, dark floral honey as well, and this is when the honey really started to take a hold of this cup, as that was something I'd experienced in significant abundance. But otherwise, I was actually quite impressed with that orange-like experience I'd had, as it was a little unique to this coffee from a lot of other things I'd experienced. So really enjoyed this day 22 mark, and went back to that same recipe on day 24, and this is the best the coffee had been up to this point. It was tricky to tell if it was the recipe, the adjustments, or just the progress of this coffee, as it felt significantly more clean. So I'd been kind of harping on the cleanliness earlier in this coffee, but it improved so much. Again, very reminiscent of what I would describe as an orange creamsicle, but depth to the cup as well, with this sensational peachy quality as it cooled. Fruit components dominating what was a layered cup with high sweetness. Definitely the best day I'd experienced, and truth be told, I actually wasn't able to replicate this day going forward. But we'll continue with the notes, as on day 26, ran it through the V60, and this is why I decided to settle on the Chemex, as this day continued to remain layered, but not to the same extent as the Chemex was, as that was really like defined, well descripted. But on this day, it didn't seem to have that same sort of orange creamsicle sort of vibrancy, but rather focused a little bit more on the florality, honey that was being encompassed by the chocolate aspect. Still good, but since there was less fruit, didn't enjoy it as much as I'd enjoyed it through the Chemex. Tried it one more time through the V60, and once again, still really like it a lot more through the Chemex, as this one seemed to accentuate more of those chocolate and nutty characteristics, more of the traditional Central American characteristics, as opposed to the really bright fruits that I was experiencing from the Chemex. Most defining aspect is the light honey yet again. And then day 31, went back to the Chemex to see if it truly was the Chemex, and once again, it was reminiscent of that day 24 mark, maybe not quite as good at that day 24 mark. Floral honey at this point had become a really pronounced aspect to this coffee, because that orange creamsicle, which was the most dominant factor in those kind of mid-day 20 range, it really hadn't seemed to have that same sort of vibrancy on this day, but rather a focus on the heightened floral honey finish to the cup. Still really nice though, definitely still enjoyed it best through this brew method, and there was a pretty stark contrast with how much I was enjoying them between each of those two brew methods. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, but let me insert a little caveat here that I actually made this tasting wheel with the V60 as opposed to the Chemex. But let's go through this tasting wheel because I actually looked back on it when I was trying the Chemex to see just where I might make some adjustments. But we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Interestingly enough, I would say maybe on the slightly lower side of the level 4, but that's something I mentioned really early in this video, was that it had so much vibrancy to it that at times it acted a slight bit more like a very clean natural as opposed to just a little bit more of a straightforward wash processed coffee. Even then, I think it justifies that level 4 mark. It's a pretty generally clean coffee. It's something you would expect from Passenger to just be cleaner in general. Finish, level 4, yes, and I think this coffee went through a bit of a transition throughout the entirety of the time drinking this coffee. Earlier, it had a bit more of a citric finish. At times, it had a little bit more of this nutty chocolatey finish, but towards the end, it had a much more honey floral-like finish to the cup. Nonetheless, it still reached that level 4 mark. If anything, I could say maybe slightly on the higher side of level 4, but I don't think I could push it any higher than that. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, the sweetness was a little inconsistent in this one, though. There were times I would say it was maybe on the lower side of level 4, higher side of level 3. On those best days, those day 20 marks I had experienced this coffee, I could say that it was extremely sweet and maybe even on the higher side of the level 4. So it just did kind of vary with the overall results, as this coffee wasn't necessarily the most consistent. It seemed pretty sensitive, and that's something I've noticed from a lot of Passengers coffees, is that they can be a little sensitive to even some minor adjustments. Acidity, level 4. Yes, this coffee had a fair bit of brightness to it. I'm not sure that there's too much to discuss on that. It did feel at times like a little bit of a citric brightness, but it was present throughout the entirety of the time drinking this coffee. Maybe the slightly lower side of level 4, but still a fair bit of the brightness nonetheless. Florality, level 4. Yes, but this is something that definitely increased the longer I'd been drinking this coffee, as on the earlier days, I don't know if I could even necessarily justify a level 3 mark, maybe the level 2, especially when it seemed to focus a little bit more on the citric aspects as well as the Central American characteristics, the chocolatiness, the nuttiness to the cup. So that one right there definitely did improve and increase a lot with the time in this coffee. So I think that is justified, at least towards the end, at least when we were making this tasting wheel. Saltiness, correction, we're still going back to level 4s. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, I do have to say that this is the most defined, pronounced fruit characteristic to this coffee. I think that they have an orange note listed on here. The best part of this coffee was when I was able to get that orange in a very sweet, almost ice cream, creamsicle-like manner to the coffee. That really sold this one to me, at least on those days. So citrus fruit, level 4, no question about that. Chocolate level 4, I would actually tone that down a little bit through the Chemex, as it didn't seem to have that same sort of robust characteristic to it with that brew method. Nonetheless, when brewed with the V60, it definitely seemed in about equal abundance to the citrus fruit, so I could definitely see that there. I think they have a cacao note listed on here. I think a fair bit of the development could be felt, at least in that sense, as it did have a slightly more bitter, darker chocolate aspect to this coffee. A handful of level 3s. We will start with the body of level 3. I'm not sure how much that would necessarily change. It did have a fair bit of body to it, regardless of which brew method. If anything, I could say it's a true level 3 with the V60, maybe slightly lower with the Chemex. Saltiness, level 3. That's the nutty aspect. There is a nutty aspect to this one. It's something you might expect given that it is a Central American coffee. And I feel like it was pronounced enough and something we noted frequently enough that it justified that level 3 mark. Stone fruit level 3, yes, there were times where I was able to get this peachy finish within this coffee as well. I didn't mention it too much because while it was there, it was definitely kind of more underneath some defined and pronounced characteristics to it. Nonetheless, once I was able to experience that part, it did kind of complement the very sweet citric aspect to it. So I'm quite happy that it reached that mark. That's a really positive thing for this coffee. Caramel level 3, that's that candied aspect that I like to put in here. There was a candied aspect to this coffee, and I could feel it maybe in some of the nutty aspects to this coffee and even in some of the fruit components to it. So that really did seem to help with this one as well. And those are all our level 3s and our level 4s. There's some level 2s, but I don't think that they're necessarily worth discussing. I think that this is a pretty good representation. I think there are very few adjustments I would make between the V60 and the Chemex for this tasting wheel. So I think that this is a pretty good tasting wheel for this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one's a little tricky because I can see both sides of the argument. On one side, I saw this coffee at its best when I was able to experience it at its very best. It was a wonderfully clean, vibrant, sweet, fruit-forward cup of coffee. A lot of the things I look for, especially pertaining to Mexican coffees, because this one was a little unique in terms of the experience within Mexican coffees. As traditionally you might expect some more of the traditional characteristics, a focus on the chocolate, a focus on the nuttiness, but this one being a little bit more fruit forward than those on its best days were really nice, and those days I really seemed to enjoy, and I could say that I enjoyed it maybe even more than the other passenger coffee, the Mexican passenger coffee we'd reviewed, because of those fruit aspects. But at the same time, I kind of mentioned this one was a little bit more inconsistent. This one was a little bit more tricky. And towards the end, it seemed to just go in a direction that I wasn't necessarily looking for. I struggled to replicate the absolute best of this coffee as well. And there was a little bit of a smoky quality at the time, a little bit of a focus on some other characteristics, most specifically that chocolate that didn't necessarily sell me on this coffee too frequently. So at its best, it's great. Otherwise, it was just an okay coffee. I don't have too much complaints about it nonetheless, because even when it wasn't necessarily at its best for me, it was still an enjoyable coffee, if maybe not necessarily exactly what I was looking for with this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think still kind of leaning a little towards your traditional Mexican, traditional Central American coffee drinker, because it does offer a fair bit of those, and regardless of what else you're able to get from this coffee, those have been ever present and those were consistent throughout the time drinking this one. In addition to that, though, if you do like the clarity, because the clarity was really nice, but at the same time are looking for a much more vibrant fruit manner to a coffee, then this has those things complemented with those traditional characteristics. And the honey florality towards the end of this coffee is a little bit of a curveball with all of those things. But I think if you're just kind of looking for all of those components, these are all factors that you do enjoy in your coffee, then this could blend really well for you. As mentioned, at its best, it's really nice, so I feel like a lot of people would find it at its best to be a very enjoyable coffee, and I think that's just kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, as it was our coffee of the month, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Hermenegildo Marin Wash Process Mexico from Passenger Coffee. Thank you for watching.